you don't support traditional art by embracing attitudes that, if they had been held in the past, would have prevented that art from being made in the first place.
G'day everyone, my name is Mark Makievsky from the Thomas More Center channel, and today it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Daniel Mitsui. Daniel is an artist and poet best known for his meticulously detailed ink drawings. Daniel, welcome to the channel.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you. Thank you for saying yes. So firstly, in order to, I guess, get a picture of who you are, could you give us a brief background about, your childhood, when you first discovered your artistic talents, and the journey you took to become an artist?
Sure. I was raised near Chicago, sort of in the suburbs of Chicago, and um, you know, lived in that area most of my life. And I had artistic inclinations from a very young age. Drew sort of incessantly from the time that I can first remember. I think that I seized on the idea of being a creative person as sort of that being my identity more in adolescence. I think I discovered, medieval styled art fairly early on, through picture books and movies first, and then reproductions of actual works probably when I was maybe 14 or so. And that became a real source of fascination for me that never left. Was not really raised religiously. The family was, if it was anything, it was Catholic. It was Christmas and Easter, but I did not receive the sacraments as a child. Still had, religious faith, and ultimately was initiated into the church when I was in college, so at the age of 22.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I had been I'd been studying art and working in a lot of styles. I had a strong interest in certain types of modern art. I had a strong interest in cartooning, in film animation. But when I sort of took up the religious practice, I was also at a point where I was, graduating from college and trying to figure out what sort of professional path I wanted to take. And I saw one that was leading more toward humorous art and one toward religious art, which were the two types that really I felt that I had, both the interest and the ability to make. And I decided to pursue the religious art, and that really has been what I've done ever since. I mean, I do some other things on the side, but that's my specialty. Yeah, that was something I did sort of as a supplemental endeavor, kind of a part-time job for a number of years. I became a full-time professional about 2010 or so.
Okay.
At that point, I was married and had my first child.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have four, but I've been earning my livelihood as well as I can since then as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, I've expanded a little bit. I've started writing more, particularly verse. I've taken up designing typefaces, doing some ornamental designs, things like that. But religious art is still the bulk of what I do.
Right. You said earlier, you said just before that you kind of weren't raised in the faith, but you had a very religious sensibility. Can you tell us about how it was the faith resonated with you when there wasn't let's say, a strong upbringing with it?
The exposure that I did have to it, occasional attendance at mass left a strong impression, but I think that it was largely through the historical and artistic record of the Catholic Church that I came to develop an idea of what that represented. That might perhaps have been maybe that was better for me, rather than viewing it mostly through typical parochial life on a local
Hmm.
level. I mean, certainly, it's not normal, but probably if you'd asked me when I was, say 16, for example, would I consider myself to be Catholic? I would have said yes, but my idea of what that is more formed by what I was reading in history textbooks or what I was seeing in artistic examples.
Hmm.
A few things that left a very strong impression on me were encountering illuminated manuscripts for the first time, as reproductions, not really as
Hmm.
things I saw in person. Also, the first time that I saw a large Gothic church,
Hmm.
those things definitely left a very strong impression upon me.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've had limited experience with the illuminated manuscript tradition, but I came across an image by Berthold Furtmeyer from the 15th century, and it's just incredible stuff. And I'm so glad to see kind of you helping revive it a little bit because it's stunning stuff. Um,
Yeah,
okay, so
that's
I go ahead.
I mean, that's the tradition that is probably the one that left the strongest influence on me.
Hmm.
I haven't put together a full manuscript in terms of a whole book. I mean, that would be a very kind of expensive endeavor, but I've done so many drawings and calligraphic works that are like individual pages out of a medieval
Hmm.
manuscript.
Yeah. So you've described your style as international Gothic. And when people think of Gothic, they're thinking of the medieval architectural style known for its vaulted ceilings, its gargoyles, and flying buttresses. However, you've defined Gothic art as simply that which has been made according to Christian principles that are everywhere and enduringly true. Could you tell us what you mean by this?
Sure. I would say that's not, to me, a definition of Gothic art. It's a description of Gothic art. I
Okay.
don't think Gothic art is the only type of art that can communicate truly Christian principles. I think it's the best example within history that we have of an art that does that, and so I use it as sort of the starting point.
Hmm.
Uh, what I think is really wonderful about Gothic art is not so much that it's not because it's European, it's not because it's medieval. It's because it's both traditional and beautiful, and it understands um, those two things on a theologically. And I think those are really the necessary elements to making religious art.
Hmm.
By tradition, I mean it's it's based on things that are actually handed down from the public revelation of Jesus Christ when he was alive on earth. And so you can see there's it's a little hard to just demonstrate it through historical examples as being as unbroken as we would like to believe it to be,
Hmm.
just as a matter of faith. But there are certain just conventions of iconography, the subject and arrangement of the pictures that you can trace from very early on in the history of the church through the Gothic art.
Hmm.
And I think even more than specific compositions, there is a sense of agreement with the traditional liturgy and with the exegesis of the church fathers. You see the same symbols being communicated in all three ways, liturgically, artistically, and exegetically. Uh, they all sort of corroborate each other. You see a treatment of sort of light and shadow, of time and space that are very agreeable to sort of say metaphysical ideas that you read in the theologians. And so I think all that is it characterizes Gothic art in a way that I don't think any other uh, sort of style or idiom of art does quite so excellently. I think, on the other hand, there's the sort of obligation to beauty, which I mean, it seems almost like a trite thing to say everybody loves beauty. Of course, we love beauty. But I think there's a more profound way of understanding that. And I think the best person who described that was St. Hildegard. She wrote this one of her epistles. It was to the prelates of Mainz, where she talked about how, and she was speaking specifically about music, but about how the experience of humanity in the Garden of Eden was like all beautiful. She said that the voice of Adam was so beautiful, no fallen being could endure it. And she said that the reason that music appeals to us is because we all bear within us sort of this dim memory of that Edenic experience. And like I said, she was writing specifically about music, but I think you could apply that to the experience of beauty in any form. That the reason that beautiful forms appeal to us in art or in nature is because they're reminding us on some very deep level of what it was like before the fall. And so the reason we want to live our lives in beauty is because it's drawing us just a little bit closer to that sort of beatitude. It's making us want to aspire for that, also on like a moral level. And so the thing that I think is important, to take away from that is that the ideal of our art is something that is unattainable in the fall. It's something we're going to strive toward, but we can never say it's done, it's finished, this is good enough. And so I don't like when you see people, very often people who are very, traditional in terms of how they view religious art, and they're very adamant about the traditional aspect being correct, but they sort of say, well, we just want it to be the way it was in the past, and that's good enough. Let's say that this particular painter or this particular style of music is our ideal. Let's just do that because that means we'll know it will be good. But that sort of cuts off the actual purpose, which is to strive for higher and higher and higher, levels of excellence that are closer and closer and closer to the actual origin. And so I see that sort of ambition in the Gothic era. It is a huge leap of sophistication that happens very rapidly between, you look at art from 1100 and 1200, and you see enormous developments, and it spread very quickly. It developed very quickly. Over the several centuries that it was the dominant style, it was absorbing many influences and many new media. I mean, there's really great technological development in that time period where you see stained glass, you see these architectural innovations, you see the invention of oil paint, you see the invention of the printing press, and the Gothic artists really, were not closed to any of this and saw this all as an opportunity to make things better and better. And so I like that both of these aspects were there. And so I like to sort of put myself in that mindset of saying, how can I be faithful to both of these ideas? And that to me is what Gothic art can teach me. And that's also why it's, like I said, it's my starting point.
So some of your early art was influenced by Max Ernst, and you've described Hieronymus Bosch as a favorite of yours. These two artists could loosely be described as surrealists. So what is it about their work that you like, and how does it fit into the international Gothic style that you favor?
Max Ernst was probably my favorite artist between the ages of, say, like 17 and 20 or so. It was 21, which were actually really important formative years for me because that was when I was studying art, like most formally. And what I really admired about Ernst at the time was, he had a way of combining sort of more realistic, recognizable figures and shapes and items with a sort of chaotic patterns of the sort you see in nature. I'm thinking particularly of his decalcomania paintings, which were what I first encountered, just in encyclopedia. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. This was Europe after the rains, I think. And also, I liked his collage works. He really kind of pioneered that medium, and just I kind of draw like somebody who makes collages in that, I think my pictures fundamentally are composed of overlapping shapes bearing different patterns, whereas I think a lot of other artists are their pictures are fundamentally composed of light falling on three-dimensional objects. And so just that different compositional approach is something that I think I felt maybe I learned it from him, or maybe I just felt an affinity with him there. Obviously, his bent is not religious at all. He was, fairly hostile to his Catholic upbringing. I do think that the surrealism is not really what appealed to me about him. It was more on a visual level, because I think, if you were to define surrealism, its underlying ideas are Freudian. That's basically what surrealism is. It's very Freudian art, and I was never particularly interested in that aspect of it, which is of him or of the other surrealists. Even though there were a number of artists that I liked on a visual level, I do think that they were pretty good tastemakers for me, in that they introduced me to a lot of artists. And I don't remember specifically, but I may have discovered Bosch from reading about him as an influence upon some of these 20th century artists, in which case I would be very grateful. Now with Bosch,
Who's in the background by the look of it, over
yes,
your shoulder.
he's
Yeah.
right over my. I
Hmm.
was going to say he's right over my desk every day. I'm very much an admirer of Bosch, although I feel that I've not really absorbed his influence as much as I would like. Um, with Bosch, the imagery is also very bizarre, and that's why the surrealists liked it. I don't think that you can understand it on Freudian terms. I think that Bosch, he's not as difficult to understand as some people think. That's my belief, and I know that there there are some art historical theories that are not really taken very seriously um, by most art historians, which sort of read all sorts of bizarre, almost conspiratorial things into Bosch's artwork. There was one study that's largely discredited. I'd say, I'd flatly just say it is discredited, claiming that he belonged to this heretical Adamite sect, and that all of these symbols are like, communicating these heterodox religious ideas. And there's no evidence for that at all. Even that this particular cult existed anywhere within 100 years of where Bosch lived. From everything we know about him, he was a pious, devout, and well-respected member of the church, and was believed to be so by almost everybody up until the 20th century. And I think, once you get to the modern era, there are people who will look at his work and they really love it because it's so weird, but they have a hard time admitting that something that they find so appealing could be motivated by anything as, to their minds, ordinary as sincere and orthodox Christian belief.
Hmm.
I think that Bosch draws upon a sort of fascinating tradition that exists in the margins of medieval art. I can say that literally because the place you see it most is in the margins of illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah, right.
The drolleries. You see the borders of illuminated manuscripts, and they're full of these sort of hybrid monsters. Sometimes these stories taken from secular medieval literature, sometimes bizarre and almost shocking imagery. And this is an aspect of medieval art that I don't really believe is symbolic. I would think it's mnemonic. There's a scholar named Mary Carruthers whose works I think make a pretty convincing case for this. She's just one of the big experts on the art of memory in the Middle Ages. And I think an important thing to remember about books in the Middle Ages is that this was an era in which books were considered as aids to memorization and not as substitutes for memorization. It was expected, for example, that clergy would have the Psalter committed to memory. And nowadays, when we're used to sort of just saying, well, we have it in a book, why do I need to memorize it? It seems almost like an impossible task. It's like, oh, memorize the Bible. It's like, who can do that? But it's possible. And there are people who, train their minds using sometimes very old mnemonic techniques to commit books to memory. And if you studied that at all, you would know a few things, one of which is that spatial memory is much stronger than sort of verbal memory. And so if you're going to memorize a Psalter, it helps to use the same book, the same physical copy all the time, and to take note of the placement of words on the page, to know where it is, in located as like a coordinate on the page. And if you have some imagery to associate with that, like a picture, that's very helpful. And the thing about mnemonic devices and mnemonic cues is that they're more effective when they are not directly related to content that you're trying to remember, and they're more effective if they're bizarre. And so when I see this whole kind of, this bizarre imagery in the margins of manuscripts, I think that that's really what its purpose is. This is something that helps people commit these books to memory. And you see, other places where this sort of bizarre imagery creeps up, and sometimes it's more of a functional thing, like like gargoyles. I mean, they're sort of they're kind of like vomiting, and so you wouldn't really depict a saint doing that. You see the misericord carvings and sort of these little, it's like a kind of piece of furniture that monks would lean against and to help them rest themselves during the long recitations of matins and such. And on the undersides of these, in so many choir stalls, you have comical or bizarre, the same type of things you would see in the manuscript margins. And it's like, well, you're basically sitting on it, so you don't want to saint there either. So there's this whole marginal tradition, which I think is most clearly seen in the manuscripts and is in that case is mnemonic. And what I think Bosch does is he sort of just lets this kind of run riot over the central panels of his paintings, in which which they used to not really be allowed there. But the elements were all in the artistic tradition. They just weren't kind of mixed together like that. And so when I look at Bosch, I mean, I don't know that he thought of it this intentionally, but I see the meaning of Bosch is in sort of the basic religious content. Here's a crucifixion, here's Saint Anthony, and that what it's communicating on top of that really is sort of like, remember this. I feel he lived at a time of very rapid change. The tail end of the 15th, early 16th centuries, just, I mean, politically, economically, technologically, religiously, there's so many things just happening that probably seemed very chaotic, that the whole medieval order was kind of sort of on the verge of disappearing. And Bosch's art is kind of like this last sort of hurrah. And I think that it is what it says to me, at least, is don't forget this. Remember all this. And that's kind of what it shows to me.
Great. So I guess pulling it back a little bit is some people would be curious about the fundamentals of what it is that, or how you put an artwork together. So I was hoping you could just briefly describe the process of how you make a drawing from its commission to its completion.
Well, one thing that is kind of curious about me is that I'm not really a sketcher. I know a lot of artists are, and I don't really make sketches, and I don't really make rough drafts. I kind of feel that when I do that, the end product tends to look a little overworked and more artificial. Something I read, William Morris kind of worked the same way, that he felt that you just when you make drafts, you're losing a bit of vitality. So I tend to when I receive a commission, I tend to just work out the basic instructions as to what goes in this picture just through correspondence earlier on. And then when I start to work, this is another thing that's a little peculiar about me, but I tend not to belabor matters of composition. I usually find that an idea for how to put the picture together comes to me pretty quickly, usually within just a few minutes. And so once I have that idea in mind, I kind of just start drawing. If the composition's bad, I'll usually figure that out pretty quickly and just start over. I think I've got enough experience that I usually don't have to do that. That's pretty rare. And I tend to take on a lot of work. I got a lot of drawings that I do, and so I have had to find ways to work, maybe more quickly than people might expect. And so my basic approach is draw as much as you can right now. And so if there's a portion of a drawing that I know exactly what goes there, I'll work on that. And then if I get to a point where I need to do more research or I need to, get a model or take a reference photograph of something to help me figure out this particular whatever. I mean, I'll just kind of leave certain areas blank and I'll work on them when I have to, but I do as much as I can to that point. And so, partially finished drawings for me usually have like all of the ornament done first. I've got lots of drawings where it's like here's the whole ornamental frame, and then there's just a blank place in the middle where the figures go, because that's does not come anywhere near as naturally to me. I can draw ornament and lettering very readily, whereas figure drawing has never been my forte, and so I'm kind of constantly struggling just to make it sufficient to its purpose. I would like at some point to make that leap where I can really say this is a great strength, but when I look at artists for whom it comes so natural, like see somebody like Hal Foster or Winsor McKay, and I'm kind of in awe. So that's kind of the basics for forming the picture. I draw things in pencil, then I go over them in ink, which is usually just a dip pen, kind of a metal tipped dip pen and a bottle of ink. Do the black first, then I do the other dark colors, usually dark red, dark blue, dark green, sepia, and then I move forward to middle colors and do the washes last. That's pretty much it. Sometimes I draw on both sides of calfskin. I like to use calfskin.
Mm-hmm.
If you draw on both sides, then you get some interesting effects because you can hold the picture up to light and see kind of hidden things that I put on the back side, or get different sort of balance of colors. So that's something that would come at the end, because I don't want to constantly be flipping the picture over.
Yeah. Is it much different from drawing on paper to drawing on calfskin, or is it kind of a similar thing?
It's more precise. Calfskin, you get a finer line because it's skin cells. It's kind of organized, whereas paper, if you look at it under a microscope, it's all these plant fibers just in all different directions. And so put ink on it, it's not going to spread out and bleed so much. It's a finer line, and it's easier to make clean corrections because you can just scrape away a layer with a knife, and it's very clean. Whereas getting ink out of getting a mistake in ink out of paper is trickier and requires roughening up the surface a bit, and which is then something you have to work around. It can sometimes be a little fickle, but it's on the whole, it's a more forgiving surface. And so that's something I say to people who maybe are starting with calligraphy or illumination, and they say, well, I can't get it precise. It's like consider what you're drawing on, because that might be part of the problem. There's some kinds of paper that are just so difficult to get a clean line on. So working with that, don't do that.
So you've lamented that since the spirit of Gothic art was expelled from Christian Europe just as the age of exploration began, the artists of that time were never able to incorporate the art of far-off lands into their works. So is your incorporation of Japanese and Islamic styles into your own work an attempt to revive that artistic spirit?
Yeah. Like I said earlier, I think that one of the things I like about Gothic art is its sort of boundless ambitions in terms of what it's trying to do. And that I think it's in its true spirit to always give the best to God, no matter what it is, and no matter where you find it. And so, if Gothic artists encounter something new or exciting or different, they're going to try to do the best with it and not say, "Oh, well, that's not that's different. We need to keep our style so pure." And I think that encounter was already happening in the Middle Ages. I think mostly with Islamic art because of both because of the Crusades and because of just commerce and trade. You see an admiration for some of these treasures of for example, you can look at paintings by Gentile da Fabriano, and the halos in them um, they're basically platters. They're copied from like gold platters that were imported from the Mamluk in Egypt. You can even see there's Arabic writing, sometimes fake Arabic writing all over them. And so I am a big admirer of a lot of art styles that are outside of Western Christendom, and I think that it's fully within the spirit of Gothic art and Christianity to be open to learning from them. And yeah, I think that it would have been very interesting to see if sort of that artistic and aesthetic uh, mentality had still been around, for another 100 years or so, because you see sort of the beginnings of a greater awareness of the Far East. I mean, certainly there was Christian contact with China in the Middle Ages. We all know Marco Polo, but I don't think that a lot of the art was brought back. If it had been, I think it would have had an influence. I know that Albrecht Dürer did see some works of Aztec art. They were brought back in time for him to record in his journals that he looked at them, but I don't know of any European artists really looking to it and incorporating any ideas into their own work. I think it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened if Gothic art had still been the dominant style throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And so, yes, I have a very strong interest in Japanese art and Chinese art, in Islamic art and Persian art specifically. Those are kind of the non-Christian non-Christian artistic cultures that I'm most interested in.
Have you just thinking of it, I spent some time in Ethiopia and I was quite fascinated by the Ethiopian artistic style. Have you had any exposure to that at all?
I mean, I'm familiar with it.
Mhm.
It's not one that I don't think I've ever specifically tried doing,
Mhm.
but I mean, it's fascinating. I think especially some of the architectural things that they did with the rock hewn churches and just that whole approach to how you
Mm.
the sacred space that's so it's like it's just the shape of it as being like this cube sunk in the ground.
Yeah,
It's
right.
such a
And how they dug it out. I don't-
of conceiving a sacred space that seems so different than starting on flat ground and building as tall of a
yeah.
pointy as you can. I think it's fascinating. It's not something that I have really explored yet. I'm
Mhm.
certainly open.
Yeah. I found it a fascinating country because then you move to the east and there's architecture influenced by India. It's just a remarkable place. But anyway, that's my own biases coming in. But so just changing over to the, I guess, not so recent event of Notre Dame Cathedral and its roof burning down. I think you surprised a few people when you said that the demand to rebuild Notre Dame exactly as it was is troubling. And so I was hoping you could elaborate on this for us.
Yeah, I think what I would like to just advise people who would consider themselves religious or artistic traditionalists to keep in mind is that you don't support traditional art by embracing attitudes that, if they had been held in the past, would have prevented that art from being made in the first place. And I understand that people are afraid that when Notre Dame gets damaged, the people in charge of rebuilding it are going to do something modernizing and destructive, or destructive is the wrong word, inappropriate, to put something inappropriate. But in the past, a church fire was always seen as an opportunity. And this is, in fact, how some of the Gothic cathedrals were built in the first place. There's even, I forget which city it was, but there were rumors that the bishop started the fire because he wanted a Gothic cathedral like they have in Chartres and in Sens, and he was stuck with this old one. Whether that's true or not, whenever there was a disaster like that, it was an opportunity to say, let's do something better. Let's do something great. And okay, fine. Maybe people don't trust the artists nowadays to do that. But if you just sort of say, well, we need it to be exactly as it was before, people are just going to use tech for that. You know, we have 3D printers, we have a very, extensive photographic record of the building. So if you say, well, let's do it exactly, they're just going to say, well, let's gather up a bunch of the photographic record, run an AI program to create an AutoCAD pattern, and we'll print it all out 3D with concrete, and who needs an artist, because we can just do that. And I feel that if you just go down that road on even one really, really prominent project like this, it's going to set a precedent, and everybody's going to want to do that because it's going to be cheap. And a lot of traditionalists will say that's great because it means there's no risk of it being redone by a modern artist. But you're cutting artists out of the out of the out of the out of the process altogether. And so what you're doing is you are removing any possibility that something better could ever be made. At least not until you change that attitude. And I sort of, this is maybe a bit of a crude metaphor, not crude, just an overly simple metaphor, but I feel when people are concerned about the state of the art in the Catholic Church, they often focus too much on, well, there's so much bad art, and we need to try to prevent more bad art from being made. And so I think when they say we want to establish standards, whether that standard is we want these rules put in place as to what kind of art you can have, or we want to say it needs to be like it was in the past, you're trying to build a floor. You're kind of saying let's raise the floor so that the worst art is up here, because right now there is no floor. There's just sort of an abyss of ugliness and banality into which Catholic art can just fall. And I understand if you're free falling into that, which I think we pretty much are, and have been for a while, you want that floor. But when you build that floor, it's almost inevitable that you're also building a ceiling. You're saying when you put these rules and these things in here, you're also putting strictures on what artists can aspire to, where it's like, there's a floor, but there's a ceiling. And at some point, you're not going to be able to make anything that's better. And Gothic art emerged because people thought we can do better. Polyphonic music emerged because people thought we can do better. All of these things that we treasure are a result of people, aspiring to that, inattainable ideal of that we've kind of, vaguely remembered, our dimly remembered Edenic experience. And if you cut that off, I think you're losing something that's really, really necessary and important. And to me, is losing that is worse than having to put up with a certain amount of bad art. I don't want the abyss below me, but I also don't want the ceiling above me. And I think that it's think we should have a certain amount of faith that there could be even better art in the future and that it might not be far off. Sometimes really great artistic developments, either on an individual level, like just a singular genius, or on a societal level, a new style and a new aesthetic emerging. Sometimes these things happen very rapidly and very unexpectedly. And I don't want to be the one who prevented that. And I think that if we just start saying, well, if something like a cathedral fire happens, we just have to recreate. I mean, the next great architect or artist might actually be there looking for an opportunity.
Mhm.
I want us to be open to that possibility of giving that to him or whoever it may be.
Yeah, no, so true. And I think it's really important that people like heed those words, because you're right. If we draw a line over history and say no, it's all fixed, you're right. It denies everyone after that an opportunity to make their mark in a really positive way. So very good. Kind of bringing us around to the disgraced priest, Father Marko Rupnik. His mosaics adorn many Catholic landmarks around the world. I was wondering what you made of those, and more generally, I guess arises the question: do you think the moral life of an artist can be divorced from the artwork that he creates?
Well, first, speaking of the, if you can, to speak of the artwork just in isolation, just as a visual work. I mean, I don't like it. I've never liked it. Um, if I knew nothing about Father Rupnik, um, I mean, he's not been defrocked? Do you still call him Father Rupnik? I don't
He's
even know.
incarnated in Slovenia, but practicing in Rome still.
I suppose you still call
Mm.
him Father then. If if I knew nothing about him and just were shown these pictures, I wouldn't like them, but I wouldn't necessarily be like horrified by them. If some art student at Notre Dame came up to me and said, "Oh, Mr. Mitsui, can I show you my portfolio?" and it looked like that, I would probably try to find something encouraging to say, and I probably could. I mean, there's a few things I could pick out. So I don't think the art in itself is so horrifying that I would take offense to it not knowing anything about Father Rupnik. I think that knowing what we do, I think it certainly is. I think it should be removed from display, and that's due to a number of things that I think are important to bear in mind. The first is that his victims are still alive, um, and putting art in a space where is essentially shutting it off to them, you know, because they can't go to Lourdes or wherever it is without being traumatized, and that's certainly not something that the church should not prioritize the abuser of the victim. Um, the second thing is that, I mean, I suppose it's not been like proven legal sense, but we all basically know what happened. There's not a lot of dispute about that, and that's something that I think is important to keep in mind. In part, like you remember what I had said about Bosch, that sometimes there are artists who there are rumors about them that are just that are rumors, or sometimes are even just fantastic conspiracy theories. In the case of Bosch, some art historian centuries later said, "Oh, I think he's a heretic," which is ridiculous and unfounded. But I wouldn't want somebody to seize upon that and say, "Oh, well, we need to condemn his art because he was bad." Well, that's based on somebody else's theory. Again, like there are plenty of artists for whom I think particularly if you're I'm not particularly fond of the Florentine Renaissance, but I mean, I know most Catholics are, and we know a few things about the sort of moral environment of Florence in the 15th century. That you know, pederasty was very widely practiced then, And we know that from legal records, we know that from pulpit oratory, and there's at least some amount of anecdotal evidence that connects some of the major artistic figures to that. But it's not really proven beyond rumor. You know, if we have like this letter where somebody says, "Oh, Leonardo kept a boy," it's like, well, was this a personal enemy who was just trying to commit slander? And so I think we need to be careful not to just pass moral judgments on artists of the past based on fairly scant evidence. Um, and I think that art historians and sort of the general public, they kind of like to play up the idea of the bad boy artist, oh, all these scandalous things, and you get a very, sort of, if you do that, you get a very narrow sense of who these people are. They're complicated people, and not everything that's said about them that becomes part of the conventional wisdom about them is necessarily true. So I think in a case in like Rupnik, I think you could probably make the case about Eric Gill, where it's very well established the horrible things they did. Then that's more that's I think sufficient grounds for making a negative judgment on their art, particularly if, as in Rupnik's case, the evils that he did and the art he created are intimately connected, you know, and we know that based on a lot of testimony. And so, like, yes, I would agree with people who say we should remove his artwork. I just do think that we should be a little cautious about making blanket rules about saying if we decide you're bad, your artwork should be removed, because there's a lot of people who would fall under that condemnation who maybe would not deserve it. Rupnik's an easy case, but there are a lot of ones that are not nearly as clear.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's something slightly disturbing about Rupnik's art and the context in which it was all created. That okay, moving a little from perhaps one slightly controversial topic to another. So you attend the traditional Latin Mass, as do many, and you've said it was inevitable that you would gravitate towards it. And I was wondering what it is that attracts you to it.
Well, actually, I should say I have not attended the traditional Latin Mass in a while, just after moving, various reasons. I'll just say for various reasons. I've mostly been attending actually a Byzantine Rite church near my house for quite a while now. I think that all things being equal, I would probably attend the Latin Mass, and so just there's more complicated circumstances than that. I think that my way of thinking about religion is really is traditional in the sense that I believe that tradition is kind of the basis for our religious knowledge, and ultimately I think that's kind of what to my mind defines a traditionalist, is somebody who has kind of this epistemology that says, well, how do you know what you know as a Catholic? And I think there's different ways you can answer that. You could say, well, you know it. Well, as a Christian, there's different ways you can answer that. You could say, well, you know it from the Bible, and if it's not in the Bible, then we can't definitely say it's knowable. And that's basically the Protestant way of looking at it. It's sola scriptura. You could say, well, we know it from the guidance of the Spirit, and that's sort of, among others, would be kind of how you describe sort of progressive Christians who are not bothered by the idea that maybe you want to believe something that has never really been believed before historically. You could say, well, the Spirit is guidance, and you could also say, well, how do you know that's the Holy Spirit? There are merits and there are criticisms to that. You could take a very sort of ultramontanist approach where you say the way we know it is because, because of essentially because the magisterium declares it so in a document, and that it's essentially testing the limits of its own infallibility constantly. If it writes something and God doesn't prevent it from being written, that means it must be true. And to me, that smacks a little bit of like the theology of throwing yourself off of the pinnacle of the temple and expecting the angels to catch you. Although there's a lot of, certainly a lot of words said about that saying that's the right way for a Catholic to think. I tend to think more that the way that we know things is through ecclesiastical traditions, and that before you can declare anything magisterially, you have to know about it first. You know about it because it was carried forward in history through liturgical tradition, through exegetical tradition, through artistic tradition also. That the means of bearing these memories forward from the time of the revelation to the present is tradition. And it matters most before it is like officially declared in some form of sense, because the people who write the documents have to know what they know. And so just with that mindset, it really grates on me the idea of having a liturgy that doesn't have at least a plausible claim to continuity, in terms of in terms of really almost every aspect of its form and its content. Just as that kind of grates on the artistic level, on a theological level, on most levels. And so I really want my means of worship to really I want that to be fairly clear in the way that I worship and pray, just as I want it to be fairly clear in art and in music and in so many things. And so I feel that the older liturgical forms satisfy me on that level, and also do inspire me creatively in a way that newer liturgical forms don't. And given that most of my interests artistically are Western, ideally I would like to be able to just attend a traditional Latin liturgy and not really have to think about it as being anything unusual. And that's really what I think was kind of the great lost opportunity of that sort of brief period when it was supposedly free to everyone. Is that the people who were attached to it didn't really make it for everyone. There were a lot of people who didn't really want to expand it to being to say this is for you too, this is for everybody to come to, this is what we all used to come to, almost all, with the necessary qualifications. A lot of people just kind of wanted their own little sort of religious safe space where they were surrounded by people who thought like them and looked like them and acted like them and voted like them or whatever. They had either cultural or political or other ideological reasons for gravitating to it, which, I mean, fine, they're welcome here, but it's never was meant to be an exclusive sort of space. And that's kind of what I think was the great lost opportunity.
Yeah, very good. You wrote, I read something that you wrote on that topic, and it was, it knocked a lot of nails on the head, let's say, and I thought it was very interesting. So can you direct people, if they wanted to read about that, do you remember where that was written?
I have a Patreon page where I've been moving more of my essays, and so it's probably archived there. And if you want to just my regular website, danielmitsui.com, there's links on there, so you can go to the Patreon and probably find essays of mine in the archives.
Yeah, actually, that's a good segue into I guess, how can people support you, and are you accepting commissions?
I am accepting commissions. I've got quite a lot of them now, and so I'm mostly busy through the end of probably 2024. Except for smaller things, I could probably fit smaller things in. But no, I'm very happy to accept commissions. And the way to secure one is just to contact me, and if it's something that we're both interested in and can agree on, would be happy to hear what people would like me to draw.
Very good. All right, so we're nearing the hour, and so I thought how about we finish on more like a trivia question. Who is Daniel Mitsui's favorite church father? Or yeah, does that make sense? So if I can rephrase that, who is your favorite church father and why? I think a lot of people would be curious to know.
Well, I don't want to give the impression that I'm more widely read in patristics than I am. So I don't want to give people that impression. But I'd say the most necessary church father is, Dionysius, by whom I mean the author of the Celestial Hierarchy, the Divine Names. He is really, his thought is foundational for the emergence of Gothic art. You see it in France in the 12th century. You see a revival of interest in his work, mostly in Latin translations that were done by John Scotus Eriugena. And in that generation that includes Sujet of Saint-Denis and Hugh of St. Victor, that the attempt to put his ideas into artistic form is what ultimately led to this great flowering of artwork that is Gothic. I believe that there's another influence there too, which is Augustine. And so I think it's the combination of Dionysian thought with particularly Augustinian exegesis that really kind of defines what to me is the most satisfactory form of Christian art. That those are its intellectual bases. And I would name Augustine as my favorite church father, but I kind of, he's at once both my favorite and my least favorite, because he's, there are a number of ideas of his that are, particularly regarding, predestination and things that are a little bit out of line with the other church fathers, and which kind of trouble a lot of people, including me, a little bit, and are not necessarily things that you would expect to inspire artists. Certainly he's the Calvinist's favorite church father, and they're the most iconoclastic, Christians we have, basically. But the exegetical works of Augustine, both in terms of quantity and quality, are just so enormous. And there's so much more there than in almost any other thinker in Christian history. It's such an amazing treasury of thought that, the better half of Augustine is the greatest church father. But but you take that and you take Dionysius, you put those together, and that's what historically inspired my favorite forms of artistic expression. And so I guess that's the answer.
Very good. Daniel Mitsui, thank you so much for joining us on the Thomas More Center channel. Just a shout out for our own channel for those who are visiting us. If you could like, share, and subscribe to help us grow. We're just very young. But once again, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and all the best with your work into the future.
Thank you. This was a very interesting conversation.